Hello there and welcome. Tonight, let me gently lead you through the shadowed corridors of time, where torches flicker softly on ancient stone walls and the whispers of the past hum like a lullaby through the still air. We're stepping away from the present into the dim halls of history, the kind rarely spoken aloud where sorrow lingers and fates are sealed in silence. This evening, I'll guide you into a tale woven with both splendor and sorrow. A journey through the shocking royal deaths of the medieval world. But not in haste. No, we will move slowly, like a drifting feather on a calm midnight breeze, pausing often, breathing in the hush between each heartbeat of history. These stories are not always loud, but they echo. So if you're ready, lie back, nestle into your blanket, close your eyes if you'd like, and let the night carry you. Let's begin. Once upon a time, in the heart of the 12th century, a boy was born beneath the stormy sky of Anjou, a land of rolling vineyards and ancient castles in what is now France. The air that day was thick with rain and the earth soaked, but in the stone halls of Château d'Ange something sacred stirred. This child would become a king. And not just any king, but one whose life would both shimmer with greatness and crumble in grief. His name was Henry, son of Matilda, the empress who had once crossed frozen rivers on foot, armoured in iron will, claiming England as her right. His father, Geoffrey of Anjou, bore the title of Plantagenet, and from that union sprang the legacy that would define medieval England's bloodiest age. But tonight, we won't dwell on the rise, we'll linger gently in the fall. King Henry II of England, clever, tireless, fiery of temper, would go on to rule over a vast stretch of land from Scotland's border to the Pyrenees. But in gaining such breadth of dominion, he sowed seeds that would bloom into bitter fruit. He fathered sons, bold, beautiful, and burning with ambition, and it was those very sons who would strike at his heart in the cruelest of ways. Let me take you now with quiet footsteps to the year 1170, a year when the crown of thorns was not just Christ's alone, but mirrored in the anguish of a father. Henry the young king, not yet 20, golden-haired and hailed across Christendom, had been crowned during his father's lifetime, a symbol of unity, of preparation, of glory to come. But this coronation, rather than settling matters, ignited a storm, for the boy had no power, only pageantry, and he chafed under the shadow of his ever-dominant father. As spring turned to summer, envy and ambition festered like old wounds. The young king felt betrayed, a puppet, paraded but not respected, and so, in a twist that tore through the hearts of courtiers and commoners alike, the prince rebelled. Alongside his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, and aided by their mother Eleanor of Aquitaine, he launched a war against their own father. Imagine the sorrow. A king, betrayed not by enemies from afar, but by the very sons he had cradled as babes. The rebellion would rage for years, and though peace was made and broken and made again, something delicate had been shattered. The bond between father and son, once forged in tenderness, had been scraped thin by mistrust. And then came the plague. In the sultry summer of 1183, somewhere in the wilds of Aquitaine, the young king fell ill. It began as a fever, nothing more, but the heat climbed and his breath came shorter. Soon his skin broke into a sheen of sweat, his chest shuddered with each breath, and his once lively eyes clouded with something darker than illness. Regret. He was only 28. They say he wept in his final hours, wept for the sins he could not undo, for the father he had wronged, and for the throne he would never claim. As his strength faded, he asked to be laid upon a bed of ashes, clothed in a hair shirt, the garment of penance. Monks gathered around him, singing soft hymns as his heart slowed, each beat a whisper of sorrow. His father was not there. Henry II received word of his son's death with silence. Some say he collapsed in grief, others claim he cursed the heavens. But what history remembers is this: a father buried his son not with ceremony, but with the cold distance of a king too broken to cry. And yet it would not be the last son he would lose, nor the last betrayal he would taste. But let's pause here, let the flickering torchlight fade. Let the hush of night grow deeper, and let the name of Henry the young king drift into the stillness, a prince with no crown, a rebel with no peace, a son who, in dying, found the forgiveness he sought in life. Sleep now, softly, on the echoes of forgotten sorrow. The story will continue when you are ready. As the mourners in Aquitaine knelt beside the modest bier of the young king, silence stretched like a heavy shroud over the land. The sun, swollen and low in the sky, cast long golden shadows across the hills where once his banners had fluttered proudly in the wind. But now there were no fanfares, no courtiers, only wind and grief. The news of Henry's death drifted across the sea, reaching the aged king like a whisper from a distant grave. Henry II was in Normandy when the messengers arrived, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. The words struck him with the force of a storm, but he stood still. Shoulders squared as if by will alone he could deny the weight of what he had heard. He did not cry. But those who watched him closely would later recall the change. A dimming in his eyes, a tremble in the set of his jaw, a silence that lingered long after the room had emptied. For what can a father say when a son dies in rebellion? When love and rage have danced too closely for too long and the final word is loss? And so Henry buried his grief beneath the steel of governance. The land still needed ruling, the nobles still whispered, the church still pressed its hand against the affairs of kings. But behind every decree, behind every council held in candlelit chambers, there was a shadow. The memory of a boy who had once ridden at his side, laughing, golden alive. That shadow darkened still further in the years to come. Of all Henry's sons, the one who burned brightest now was Richard. Tall, lion-hearted and war-hardened. He had fought with vigour during the rebellion, and though peace had been forged, it was a brittle peace. Richard was no longer a boy to be appeased with lands and titles. He hungered for power, for the throne. And Henry, perhaps blinded by his need to control, refused to name him heir outright. Instead, he played his sons against one another, a bitter game of chess where love was leveraged and loyalty was tested with every move. Then came the year 1186. Geoffrey, the third son, often overlooked, often underestimated, had made his mark as Duke of Brittany. Charming and cunning, Geoffrey was known for his courtly manners and his subtle wit. But beneath the laughter there was ambition, sharp and waiting. He was a schemer, some whispered, while others saw him as the only true politician among Henry's children. In that year, Geoffrey travelled to Paris for a tournament. The French court welcomed him with open arms. King Philip II, always eager to draw England's sons into his orbit, offered both friendship and favour. And Geoffrey, ever the diplomat, basked in the attention. The tournament was to be a grand affair. Knights from across Europe gathered to tilt lances and showcase valour beneath fluttering pennants and the gaze of noble dames. The sun shone bright upon the fields outside Paris as the day's contest began. But Geoffrey did not ride. Some say he fell from his horse before the lists even opened. Others claim he was crushed during the melee, trampled beneath panicked steeds. Still others whisper of darker things. Poison, perhaps, or a quarrel turned deadly behind the curtained pavilions. What is known is that Geoffrey did not rise again. The court was thrown into chaos. Philip wept publicly for his friend, a show of grief that struck some as genuine, others as politic. Geoffrey's body was wrapped in linen, anointed with oils, and sent back toward England in solemn procession. And King Henry? He wept. The chroniclers say he tore at his beard, that he refused food and comfort for days. His son, his witty, clever Geoffrey, was gone. Lost not to rebellion, not to battle, but to fate's quiet cruelty. 2 sons dead, 2 lives snuffed out, not by enemies or traitors, but by the grinding wheel of time. Now only Richard and John remained, and where Richard roared like a lion, John crept like a shadow. Henry had always favoured the youngest, his beloved child, he called him. Small of stature, but sharp of mind, John was given lands and titles young, much to the resentment of his elder brothers. And as the years wore on, Richard's fury toward his father deepened. He demanded to be named heir. He demanded power now. But Henry, clinging still to the threads of control, refused or delayed, or promised one thing, then withdrew it with a smile. And so Richard, tired of waiting, turned to Philip of France, just as Geoffrey once had. Together they raised arms against the king. Imagine the aged Henry now, older, weaker, haunted by loss, and now betrayed again. He who had outwitted emperors and bent popes to his will was now a hollow man, hunted not by foreign invaders, but by his own blood. In 1189, as the summer sun baked the earth dry and the fields crackled with heat, Henry fled. He moved from castle to castle, trying to hold his ground, but the weight of years and grief pressed down on him like an iron crown. At Chinon, his body began to fail. Fever bloomed behind his eyes. His legs trembled. His voice, once thundering with command, now cracked with every whisper. When the final terms of surrender were brought to him, offered by Richard and Philip, he lay on his sickbed, unable to rise. Among the list of names who had betrayed him, he saw John, his beloved child. It was the final blow. With a groan that echoed down stone corridors, Henry turned his face to the wall. He refused food, refused drink. The king who had once ruled an empire that spanned half of Europe now wanted only silence. And in the silence, death came. They say he died whispering the name of a son who had betrayed him. And so the mighty King Henry II was laid to rest in Fontevraud Abbey, beside the wife who had rebelled against him, and later beside the sons who had both loved and ruined him. His legacy would live on, yes, but in his death, the Plantagenet line had been baptized not in glory, but in tragedy. One father, two dead sons, two sons turned traitors, a dynasty born of brilliance and sorrow. The chill of stone cloisters whispered around Fontevraud Abbey as the heavy oak doors closed behind the mourners. Torches flickered along the damp walls, their glow catching the faint outlines of a king now silent. Henry II, once the master of England and half of France, lay entombed in stillness. Yet outside the world moved on, and at its heart a new king rose, fierce, golden, and hungry for legacy. Richard I, soon to be known as the Lionheart, ascended the throne with the thunder of drums and the weight of blood behind him. His coronation in Westminster in September of 1189 was a spectacle of brilliance. Cloth of gold gleamed beneath the vaulted ceilings, incense drifted in soft spirals toward heaven, and choirs lifted their voices in solemn praise. But beneath the chants and jewelled robes lay unrest. Richard, though crowned, was not content to rule from the safety of palaces. His heart beat for the East, for Jerusalem, for the cross, for the crimson banners of crusade. Almost from the moment the crown touched his brow, he looked toward the Holy Land. England to him was a kingdom to fund his war, nothing more. And so, in a flurry of preparations, taxes were raised, lands sold, titles exchanged like coin. Even his younger brother John was granted new territories, a peace offering, some said, to keep him loyal while Richard went abroad. But loyalty was a fragile thing. In July of 1190, Richard set sail. With him went a fleet that glittered with armour and ambition, bound for the heat and blood of the Third Crusade. He left behind a land uneasy and a brother all too eager to slip into power's shadow. Richard's crusade is a tale of legends, of sieges and duels of valour and vengeance, but our eyes tonight rest not on his battles, but on what they cost him. He returned years later, not in triumph, but in chains. Captured on his way home by Leopold of Austria, a prince whom Richard had insulted during the crusade, the Lionheart was handed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. There, in the cold dungeons of Trifels Castle, the King of England sat alone, his crown rusting in memory, king held for ransom. The news rippled through Europe like wildfire. John, ever watchful, saw opportunity. He declared Richard dead. He pressed for the throne. In whispers and dark corners, he began carving out his own authority, convincing nobles and courtiers to abandon the Lionheart. But Richard lived. It was Queen Eleanor, aging now, but still burning with the fire of her youth, who rallied support. She raised the ransom, a king's fortune in silver, taxed and scraped from an already bleeding land. Nearly 2 years passed before Richard was finally freed in 1194. He returned not as a hero, but a storm. Those who had betrayed him felt his wrath. Castles were razed. John, forgiven publicly but watched closely, was stripped of his ambitions, for now. But something in Richard had changed. He no longer sought the Holy Land, he no longer gloried in the crown. Instead, he turned his gaze to France, for while he had languished in prison, Philip II of France had chipped away at the vast Plantagenet lands, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, all now under threat. And Richard, ever the warrior, took up arms once more. He rode across France in gleaming mail, reclaiming castles, repelling invaders, always at the front of the line. No longer a crusader king, now a warlord monarch. Then came Chalus. It was a quiet, nameless place in Limousin, little more than a hilltop fortress. Word reached Richard in March of 1199 that a local lord had discovered treasure buried on his land and refused to share it with the crown. Richard, ever zealous in defending royal rights, laid siege. It should have been nothing, a skirmish, a footnote. But fate often waits in the shadows of the ordinary. As the king walked the perimeter of the siege, inspecting defences beneath a pale spring sky, a crossbow bolt whistled through the air. It struck him in the shoulder near the collarbone. The wound seemed minor. The bolt was removed. Richard, always stoic, joked about the injury, but within days his flesh darkened. Fever gripped him. Infection, the quiet killer of ages, crept through his blood. He knew. He had seen death before. As he lay in his tent, surrounded by the hush of servants and the murmurs of priests, he asked to see the boy who had shot him. The young archer, only a teenager, was brought in trembling, and Richard, fierce, unpredictable Richard, forgave him. "Live," he said. "You have done what many have tried." And then, after years of war and wandering, the Lionheart's breath slowed. The same hands that had drawn swords now lay still upon linen sheets. He died as he had lived, on foreign soil, amidst stone and fire. He was 41 years old. His body was taken to Fontevraud Abbey beside his father, Henry II. There, beneath cold arches and flickering votive candles, the father and son now lay together, rulers of an empire, sundered by ambition, bound in death. But peace was not to follow. For with Richard's death, the crown passed not to a hero, but to a shadow. John, once mocked as Lackland for having no inheritance, now ascended the throne, the youngest son, the survivor. But his reign would soon be marked by betrayal, cruelty, and one of the most mysterious royal deaths in medieval history, one that would haunt England for generations. And so, in the gathering dark, a new chapter began, and with it, the slow unravelling of a dynasty soaked in both splendour and blood. The crown that slipped onto John's brow in 1199 did not gleam with glory, it throbbed with uncertainty. His brothers Henry and Geoffrey had died young. Richard had perished in battle. Now, the last son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine stood alone upon the throne, a man many believed would never rule, and perhaps should never have ruled at all. He was not a warrior like Richard, nor a statesman like Henry. He lacked his mother's fire, and where his siblings had inspired loyalty or fear, John often inspired something quieter, but no less dangerous: contempt. He began his reign amidst whispers and suspicion. The French territories the Plantagenet crown, hard won by his father and grandfather, eyed him with scepticism. In Anjou and Maine, nobles stirred restlessly. In Paris, Philip II of France, ever the vulture, circled above the chaos. John acted quickly, marrying Isabella of Angoulême, a child of 12, though she had already been promised to another noble. This single move, driven perhaps by desire or strategy, sparked the beginning of his troubles. The jilted noble, Hugh de Lusignan, cried foul and turned to Philip. The King of France, eager for a reason to strike, summoned John to court, but John, proud, reckless, refused to appear. Philip declared John's continental lands forfeit. The war that followed was swift and humiliating. By 1204, Normandy was lost. Anjou and Maine followed. The sprawling Angevin Empire Henry II had once commanded shrank overnight like a dying fire. John returned to England, defeated and bitter. His gaze now turned inward, and with it came a new phase in his rule, one of suspicion, revenge, and whispers of death. Among the most troubling of those whispers was the fate of a child. Let us move now, slowly, into the soft, sorrowing glow of candlelight, where the tale of Arthur of Brittany flickers like a dying flame. Arthur, the son of Geoffrey, John's elder brother, was a boy of promise. Heir to Brittany, nephew of King Richard, and by some reckoning, rightful king after Richard's death. Many in England and abroad believed Arthur had the better claim. He was legitimate, descended from an elder brother and born of royal blood. In the court of Philip II of France, Arthur was welcomed, encouraged, and named Duke of Brittany. Some even addressed him as king. John, who had just taken the throne, saw in Arthur not a boy, but a threat. In 1202, while campaigning in Poitou, Arthur led a rebellion against John's rule, with French support and noble backers. At just 16, he rode into war not with a king's certainty, but with a prince's hunger. But the rebellion was crushed. At Mirabeau, John's forces captured Arthur and many of his supporters, including Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, who had taken refuge there. It was a personal triumph for John, swift, decisive, and devastating to his enemies. But what followed was not triumph, it was silence. Arthur was imprisoned in Falaise, in Normandy. He vanished from public view. Some say he was treated well at first, given food, company, even music. But others claim the boy was beaten, isolated, and left in a darkness that grew thicker by the day. Then came the spring of 1203. A chronicler in Brittany wrote that John visited Arthur's cell that Easter. They spoke, voices raised, something slammed, footsteps echoed down stone corridors. After that, no one ever saw Arthur again. The rumours spread quickly like smoke through dry leaves. One tale claimed John killed Arthur himself in a fit of rage, with his own hands in the flickering torchlight of the dungeon. Another claimed the boy was blinded and castrated, his body thrown into the Seine. Still others whispered that he was taken by boat, bound and gagged, and drowned in the black waters beneath the moon. John never confirmed the boy's death, but from that moment on, his reputation shifted. He was no longer merely the unlucky king who had lost Normandy. He became something darker, a murderer of children, a tyrant in waiting, and the people began to murmur. The barons watched him with wary eyes. The church held its breath. Even the common folk, who knew nothing of royal lineage or Plantagenet succession, felt a chill in the air. For if a king could kill his own nephew, his blood, what else might he do? John continued to rule, but his kingdom grew restless. His taxes became unbearable, his wars fruitless. His excommunication by the Pope in 1209 widened the rift between crown and altar, and yet still the crown clung to his head. But Arthur's absence haunted him. In dreams, perhaps, the boy came, his eyes dark with river water, his voice a whisper inside cold castle walls. Chroniclers noted John's worsening temper, his erratic commands, his sudden outbursts of cruelty. It was as if the silence around Arthur's death was louder than any accusation. And so Falaise Castle, a grim place of stone and echo, became forever tied to a prince who vanished. No grave, no final words, just a name carried on the wind and the knowledge that power, in the wrong hands, can turn even family into prey. Years later, as rebellions kindled and swords were drawn, many would remember Arthur, not as a king, not even as a warrior, but as a boy, young, proud and betrayed, a ghost in the corner of John's reign. And in that silence, the Plantagenet crown weighed heavier than ever before, for it was no longer a symbol of order, but a relic, cracked by blood. The year was 1215, and the throne upon which John sat had grown colder with each passing season. Around him, England churned in discontent, not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, collective anger of men pushed too far. The barons, once deferential and cautious, now whispered openly of betrayal. Taxes had drained them, justice was scarce, the church had been insulted. And beneath it all, the memory of Arthur of Brittany still festered like a wound that refused to close. John, it seemed, could no longer inspire fear, only defiance. His court became an island in a rising tide of resistance. The royal forests, once sacred preserves of the crown, now harboured fugitives and rebels. Towns murmured with unrest. Castles were fortified not for the king's defence, but in preparation against him. The barons began to gather in secret, drafting demands. Not in the name of war, but of restraint. They no longer sought conquest, they sought limits. And so, in June of that year, on the flat, marshy fields of Runnymede, King John met them. It was not a moment of triumph. There were no trumpets, no parades, just tents pitched in the long grasses near the River Thames, and under their canvas shadows, angry men in mail and wool. With gritted teeth and the weight of centuries behind them, they pressed a parchment into the king's hands. It bore the title Magna Carta, a Charter of Liberties, a demand bound in ink and will that no man, not even a king, was above the law. John, cornered and without an army, sealed it. The wax melted, hardened, and history shifted, but the peace, like so many made in haste, would not last. Almost at once, John sought to undo what he had sworn. He sent word to the Pope, pleading for annulment. The barons, enraged, renounced their loyalty. War erupted, not foreign, but civil. England fractured. And in that war, John's shadow grew longer. He marched across the realm, burning the homes of those who defied him. Crops were torched, castles besieged. The land groaned under the weight of vengeance. He laid waste not with strategy, but with spite. Then, in the autumn of 1216, as storms lashed the coast and hunger stalked the countryside, John rode into the eastern marshlands. He was attempting to regroup, to outflank the rebels who had invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English crown. But nature, ever impartial, struck back. Crossing the estuary near the Wash, John's baggage train, carrying treasure, relics, and perhaps even the crown jewels, was caught by the rising tide. Carts, horses, soldiers, all were swallowed by the sea's sudden fury. The quicksand dragged them down. Armour sank like stone, and with them, the last symbols of royal glory disappeared beneath the waves. John, soaked and shivering, pressed on to Newark Castle. It was there, within its thick stone walls, that his body began to fail him. Fever bloomed once more, a familiar end for many of his line. Some say it was dysentery, others suspect poisoning. Regardless, the result was the same. He weakened quickly. Servants moved silently through the castle's corridors. Candles were lit. Priests were summoned. The king, once feared for his temper and defiance, now lay wrapped in sweat-stained linen, mumbling incoherently. Some say he raved about the lost treasure, demanded it be recovered, cursed the sea itself. Others say he cried out in the night, haunted by the face of Arthur, the nephew who never grew old. Perhaps he saw his father Henry seated on a throne of judgment, or Richard waiting with drawn sword. Whatever the visions, John died on the night of October 18th. He was 49 years old. There was no triumph in his passing, no songs, only a kingdom in chaos, and a boy of 9, his son Henry, left to inherit the crown of thorns. They buried John in Worcester Cathedral, between the shrines of saints, a quiet, unlikely resting place for a man whose life had been filled with rage and failure. His tomb bears no scowl, no grimace, just the cold stone likeness of a king whose name would echo down through centuries as a warning. John Lackland, the king who lost Normandy, the king who killed his nephew, the king who signed the Magna Carta and broke it. And as the torches burned low in the cathedral that night, the monks chanted softly, their voices echoing against vaulted ceilings as if to cleanse the air of what had passed. Yet even in death, John's legacy was not finished, for the boy he left behind, young Henry III, would grow to rule longer than any king before him. But even he would not escape the darkness that lingered from the Plantagenet bloodline, because that darkness was patient. It waited in council chambers, in narrow halls, in the poisoned smiles of cousins, in the jealous eyes of brothers, and in time it would strike again, not against a king, but against a queen, one who would rise, beloved, and fall, abandoned. The wind moved softly through the cloisters of Winchester as the boy king, Henry III, was crowned in a rush of ceremony and fear. England was not at peace. The soil still bore the bruises of civil war, and French soldiers walked her roads, believing they would inherit her crown. But in that moment, with trembling hands and sacred oil, the Archbishop anointed a child, not yet 10, to sit upon a throne cracked by rebellion. It was not a coronation born of grandeur, but of necessity. And yet Henry would reign. He would reign for over 50 years, longer than any king before him, his rule stretching like a shadow from the wreckage of John's death into a new, uncertain century. But though time dulled the edges of civil war and the crown was steadied by loyal advisors and a vigilant church, one truth remained. The Plantagenet line was never meant for peace. The darkness that had devoured uncles and fathers lingered still, not in battles alone, but in the quiet chambers of power where ambition whispered like a serpent. Henry, gentle by nature, was a man of piety and dreams. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey, commissioned magnificent works of art, and aspired to holiness in a realm grown cynical. He believed in divine order, in monarchy as a sacred trust. But he was blind to the hunger around him. The nobles who had knelt in loyalty as he grew into manhood soon grew restless. They watched as foreign favourites, especially his wife's relatives, the Lusignans, filled court offices. They watched as the king lavished funds on foreign campaigns, papal tithes, and vast building projects, while the realm groaned beneath debt. And into that resentment stepped a man whose name would carve itself into the heart of English history, Simon de Montfort. Tall, commanding, fiercely intelligent, de Montfort had married Henry's sister Eleanor, a match forged in love, albeit not diplomacy. But what began as family soon turned to rivalry. For de Montfort, though loyal, saw the king's failings with clear eyes. He saw favouritism, weakness, ruinous spending, and above all, a disregard for the voice of the barons who had, once again grown tired of royal excess. By the 1250s, whispers of reform became open demands, and Henry, ever torn between faith and pride, made a fateful decision. He agreed. In 1258, at the Parliament of Oxford, the provisions were written, a radical document stripping the king of personal control and placing power into the hands of a council of barons. For a time, England was ruled not by a monarch, but by oligarchy, and de Montfort stood at its head. But power is a flame that burns. Even those who wield it with care may find themselves engulfed. The council fractured, the nobles bickered. Henry, waiting patiently, slowly rebuilt support, and in 1261, with the Pope's blessing, he renounced the provisions. War returned. The realm again became a field of broken promises and clashing swords. De Montfort did not retreat. He rallied his forces and in 1264 met the king's army at Luz. There, amidst blood and thunder, he won. The king was captured. So too was his son Edward, the future king, the Iron Prince. For a moment, de Montfort held more power than any man in England, but power, once tasted, reveals all truths. Though he governed with vision, calling the first parliament that included commoners, de Montfort's authority grew absolute. Former allies turned cold, old enemies conspired, and Edward, clever and patient, escaped. In 1265 at Evesham, it ended. The battle was short and brutal. De Montfort's forces were outmaneuvered. The floodwaters behind him swelled, cutting off retreat. His army collapsed. He was slain, and not simply killed, but butchered. His body was mutilated on the field, hacked apart by soldiers who had once sworn allegiance. His head was displayed, his limbs scattered. Only Eleanor mourned him with dignity. But in his death, something deeper stirred. A new ideal that kings could be challenged and that commoners might one day have a voice had taken root. Henry, aged and weary, resumed the throne. But the years that followed were slow and grey. He never truly ruled again with the confidence of youth. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by devotion and sorrow. He died in 1272, and the crown passed to his son, Edward, who had returned from crusade not as a diplomat, not as a dreamer, but as a warrior forged by loss and ambition. Where Henry had ruled with hope, Edward would rule with iron. But while the crown found strength again in the hands of a soldier king, the Plantagenet curse, the quiet shiver beneath glory, never faded. It would bide its time. Waiting not for a battlefield, but for a wedding. For the next great death would not be a nobleman slain in armour or a boy drowned in a dungeon, but a queen, young, beloved, and destined to leave her king with a grief so deep it would echo in stone. The coronation of Edward I was not marked by chaos or urgency. It came quietly, almost anticlimactically, as news of his father's death reached him while returning from the Crusades. There was no need for dispute, no rival claimant bold enough to challenge him. Edward was already king in the minds of his people, even before the crown touched his brow. He was tall, unusually so for his time, with sharp features and eyes that missed little. They called him Longshanks for the length of his legs and Hammer of the Scots for what was yet to come. But long before the wars that would define his reign, there was another name whispered softly through the halls of court, one not of war, but of love. Eleanor. Eleanor of Castile, his queen, his equal, his constant. Their marriage had been arranged, as all royal unions were, but what bloomed between them defied the coldness of politics. She was cultured, shrewd, and fiercely intelligent. He was pragmatic, exacting, yet utterly devoted to her. In a world where affection was rarely found between royal spouses, theirs was an exception. They travelled together, not just in courtly procession, but into real hardship. Eleanor followed Edward on campaign, across the Channel, through Europe, even into the blistering heat of the Holy Land. She gave birth to 16 children, though many of them did not survive infancy. And still, she endured, a quiet pillar beside a king of steel. It was during one of those far-off journeys, during the 9th Crusade, that a tale arose, one half legend, half whispered truth. Edward had been wounded. A dagger, poisoned, thrust at him by an assassin. The blade sliced his arm. Infection crept close. And Eleanor, devoted, desperate, was said to have sucked the poison from the wound with her own mouth, risking death to save him. Whether the story is fact or romance woven into history, it remains. It speaks not of thrones or treaties, but of a bond forged beyond duty. A love rare among royals, They returned from the east changed. Edward was crowned in 1274 and Eleanor stood beside him, not as ornament, but as partner. Together they rebuilt the kingdom. Together they journeyed endlessly through England, not staying in palaces, but moving, observing, ruling with presence. They were rarely apart. And then came the year 1290. Eleanor had accompanied Edward north as he dealt with Scottish affairs, stopping in town after town, court after court. But by late autumn, her health began to fail. She had borne the weight of motherhood and monarchy for decades. Now her strength ebbed away. At Harby, a manor near Lincoln, she could go no further. The chill winds of November rolled across the fens as her chamber was prepared. Physicians came and went. Clergy whispered prayers. And Edward, the king who had broken Welsh resistance, subdued rebellious barons and forged England's laws in iron, knelt beside her bed. Witnesses later said he was not composed, that his face, often carved in stern command, folded into quiet anguish. Eleanor of Castile died on the 28th of November. She was somewhere near 49. The records disagree, but what is known with utter clarity is how deeply she was loved. Edward did not return immediately to London. Instead, he made a decision that would outlast stone, time and flesh. He ordered a procession, slow, deliberate, to carry her body from Harby to Westminster, and at every resting place along the way he commanded a cross be built in her honour. 12 in total. 12 crosses, marking the path of mourning. They rose in Stamford, in Geddington, in Waltham. Masterpieces of Gothic art, chiselled with angels, saints and sorrow. Though only 3 survive today, their memory lingers in the name of Charing Cross, the very heart of London. Edward never remarried out of passion. His second wife, Margaret of France, was a political necessity. She bore him sons and he treated her kindly, but he never again knew the love he had shared with Eleanor. He carried her memory into his final years, through the wars in Scotland, through rebellions, through the endless weight of kingship. Even in death, when he commanded his bones to rest at Westminster, he left behind no grand poetic epitaph. Only one phrase inscribed in Latin above his tomb: Edwardus primus Scotorum malleus, pactus serva. Edward I, hammer of the Scots, keep the faith. But he had already left his heart behind, not in stone, not in steel, but in the quiet memory of a queen whose death cracked even the sternest crown. Eleanor's story was not one of murder, betrayal or war. But her passing marked one of the rarest things in medieval monarchy, the end of a true companionship. And still, the Plantagenet line pressed forward, for Edward's sons would not inherit his unity nor his discipline, and the next great death would not be honoured with crosses or mourning. It would be met with fire and treachery and the slow unravelling of a kingdom at war with itself. The dawn of the 14th century broke not with celebration but with unease. The death of Eleanor had left a hollow space beside the throne, and though Edward I remained a towering figure, fierce, relentless, a king of laws and conquest, the unity of his reign began to fray at the edges. He had grown old, though he rarely admitted it. His body ached, his eyes, once keen, had begun to dull, and his mind, though sharp, turned ever more toward Scotland, a land that refused to kneel. But the future of England rested not on his northern campaigns, but on the narrow shoulders of his son, Edward of Caernarfon. Born in a castle in North Wales during the height of his father's conquests, the boy had been cradled in war and expectation. He was the first English heir to bear the title Prince of Wales, a gesture meant to assert dominance over the newly subdued land. Yet from the beginning, it was clear he would never be his father's son in spirit. Where Edward I was iron, the young prince was water. He loved music and art. He delighted in games, in festivities, in things his father viewed as frivolous. He preferred the company of favourites to the burden of state. And when, in 1307, the old king finally died on his campaign north, commanding even in death that his bones be carried into battle, the crown passed to a man ill-prepared for its weight. Edward II, his coronation was held with all the pomp due a sovereign, but already the lords whispered he was too soft, too trusting, too fond of men who held no noble title or lineage. Chief among them was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of minor birth whose hold over the king was unshakable. Their relationship, shrouded in intimacy and favouritism, became a wound in the realm. Edward showered Gaveston with titles, gifts and influence. He made him Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty. He dismissed the council of his barons, preferring Gaveston's wit and charm to their stern advice. The court became a theatre of vanity and excess, and the nobles watched with narrowing eyes. Jealousy turned to fury. By 1311, under pressure, the king was forced to exile Gaveston. But Edward wept, he sent messages, and within the year, Gaveston returned. It was a fatal mistake. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster and other great lords, rose in outrage. Gaveston was seized. They gave him no trial, no audience, no mercy. On a lonely hill near Warwick, he was run through with a sword and left in the dirt like a thief. Edward was inconsolable. He withdrew. He plotted revenge. But his enemies had grown too strong and his own grip on power too weak. Then, in the years that followed, England descended into humiliation. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Edward led a massive army against the Scots, hoping to crush Robert the Bruce and avenge his father's legacy. But the campaign was cursed from the outset. His men quarrelled, his leadership faltered, and the Scots, lean and cunning, struck with ferocity. Edward fled the battlefield. It was the most crushing defeat an English king had known in a century. From that point forward, his authority unravelled like worn fabric. Into the void stepped another favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. With Gaveston gone, Edward poured all his trust into Despenser, whose cruelty and ambition dwarfed even his predecessor. Together with his father, Despenser tightened his grip on court, seizing lands, exiling rivals, and punishing those who had dared to defy the king. England writhed beneath them. The barons rose again, civil war flared, towns burned. But it was not until a woman, betrayed, humiliated, and coldly cast aside, entered the fray that the real death knell began to toll. Queen Isabella of France, the daughter of a king, wife of Edward II, mother of the heir, she had endured her husband's favouritism, his failures, and his disregard. She had been sidelined, her lands taken, her voice silenced, but Isabella was not meek. She had waited, watched, and in 1325, under the guise of diplomacy, she travelled to France with her son, young Edward, and refused to return. There, she allied with a disgraced nobleman in exile, Roger Mortimer. Their bond, whether forged in political ambition or personal passion, became a force that would tear the crown from Edward's head. Together, they raised an army. English lords, tired of Despenser's tyranny and the king's weakness, flocked to their banner. In 1326, they landed in England. Despenser and the king fled west, hunted like animals. Towns turned against them. Allies vanished. At last, near Llantrisant in Wales, Edward was captured. Despenser was dragged through the streets, tortured and hanged, his body dismembered, his name cursed. The Queen watched without flinching. Edward was imprisoned, not in one castle, but many. Moved like a prisoner no one wanted to keep, but no one dared set free. And then in January of 1327, Parliament declared him unfit to rule. It was the first forced abdication of a king in English history. His son, just 14, was crowned Edward III, and the old king, broken, shamed, disappeared behind stone walls. That winter was bitter. Edward was held in Berkeley Castle, watched night and day, and though officially he was well treated, rumours swirled that he was beaten, starved, moved constantly, stripped of dignity, that his cries echoed down the cold halls long after midnight. Then in September word came. King Edward II had died. The official cause, natural illness. But whispers. Oh, the whispers. They have never stopped, that he was smothered with pillows or drowned in a trough, or, in the most lurid version, murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker, meant to leave no visible wound. None can say for certain. No trial was held, no inquest completed. His burial was quiet, almost reluctant. His tomb rests at Gloucester Cathedral, beneath an effigy that stares upward with hollow eyes. He was only 43. And with him ended the illusion that kings were untouchable. For Edward II, mocked, exiled, and likely murdered, proved that even a crown cannot shield the body from pain, nor the soul from sorrow. And the boy who now bore his name would one day face his own reckoning, not from enemies, but from blood. The crown that once slipped from Edward II's trembling hands now sat upon the brow of a boy. Edward III, barely 14, was crowned under a sky heavy with uncertainty. The nobles bowed, the clergy chanted, and the realm, weary of unrest, looked to the youth with cautious hope. But the throne was not truly his. Not yet. Behind the veils of ceremony and scripture, two shadows moved with purpose. His mother, Queen Isabella, and her companion, Roger Mortimer. Together they had deposed a king. Together they now ruled in his place. Isabella, once humiliated, now held court with regal certainty. Mortimer, once an exile, now commanded like a sovereign. They styled themselves as guardians of the young king, but their power was not borrowed, it was seized. Land, wealth, titles, all passed through Mortimer's hands. And the boy, though king in name, lived in gilded silence. He watched, he learned. And slowly, as the years passed, the child grew into a man of steel. Edward was clever, even in youth. He listened more than he spoke. He saw how men bent their knees to Mortimer, not to him. He saw how his mother, once loving, now seemed cold, preoccupied, her hand always resting on another man's arm. The kingdom, too, began to bristle. Mortimer's arrogance bred resentment. His enemies, once cowed, began to rise. He elevated his kin, levied taxes, and demanded obedience. But he lacked the charisma of a king, and the nobles, who had endured tyranny before, began to murmur once more. Edward remained patient until he was 17. In the autumn of 1330, while the court rested at Nottingham Castle, the young king made his move. Under cover of night, through a secret passage hidden within the walls, a small group of loyal knights slipped into the tower where Mortimer slept. There was no battle, no blood spilled in the halls, only a gasp, a scuffle, and the quiet sound of iron on stone. Mortimer was dragged before Edward, who now stood not as a boy but as a king. There would be no trial by jury, only a reckoning. Within weeks, Mortimer was convicted of treason, his lands seized, his legacy erased. On a cold morning in November, he was led to the gallows at Tyburn. The crowd was silent as the noose was fixed. No cheers, no cries, just the slow creaking of rope as justice in its grim form was done. Isabella, once the she-wolf of France, was not executed. Edward spared her, perhaps out of filial piety or perhaps as a warning. She was confined instead to Castle Rising, her titles stripped, her power gone. There she lived in comfort, surrounded by luxury and memory. Her son never visited. And so Edward III began his true reign, not with violence but with control. He proved himself a king in every sense. He reformed the court, restored royal finances, and forged powerful alliances. He married Philippa of Hainault, a union born of diplomacy but strengthened by genuine affection. Their household, unlike so many before, was one of warmth and mutual respect. But beneath the golden veneer of early success, the Plantagenet legacy stirred once more. Because even as Edward ruled with vigour, the seed of conflict had already been sown, not through enemies, but through lineage, his claim to the French throne. His mother, Isabella, had been the daughter of King Philip IV of France. When the direct Capetian line died out, Edward pressed a claim to the French crown, a bold and dangerous ambition. The French rejected him, invoking the ancient Salic law that barred inheritance through the female line. Instead, they crowned Philip VI, a cousin. Edward did not forget the insult. In 1337, he declared himself rightful king of France. Thus began the 100 Years' War. A name that would not be spoken for generations, but whose blood would stain the soil of two kingdoms. Edward's campaigns were glorious. Victories at Crécy and Poitiers cemented his name in legend. The Black Prince, his eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, emerged as a fearsome warrior, commanding armies with brilliance and cruelty. But wars do not pause for mourning, and even glory exacts a cost. In 1348, as England basked in the light of military triumph, a darker shadow crept ashore. The plague, the Black Death, a sickness swift and silent, descended upon the land with no mercy. Entire villages vanished, corpses piled in the streets, monks died at their altars, children faded in their mothers' arms, no one was spared, even the royal household suffered. One of Edward's own daughters, Princess Joan, was taken while journeying to marry a Spanish prince. She died alone in Bordeaux, her body buried hastily, her name quietly struck from diplomatic treaties. And yet Edward endured. He ruled on into old age, his hair turning silver, his strength slowly draining. Philippa died in 1369, and with her, the joy that had lit the royal hearth dimmed forever. The last years of his reign were marked not by victories, but by loss. His son, the Black Prince, grew ill, not from wounds, but from something deeper. Some say dysentery, others a wasting disease. The once mighty warrior who had terrified France could now barely rise from his bed. He lingered for years, And in 1376, 1 year before his father's own death, the Black Prince died. He was only 45. Edward, heartbroken and frail, now faced a bitter truth. His heir was gone. His kingdom, strained by war and plague, stood at the edge of exhaustion. The crown would pass to his grandson, a child of 10. And as the bells tolled for his son, Edward remained in his chamber at Sheen Palace. He rarely spoke. He wept often. When death finally came in 7, it came quietly, not with the cries of battle, but with a sigh, a fading echo of a once mighty reign. He was 64. And thus ended the life of Edward III, a king of splendour and suffering, who raised England to greatness and watched as it slipped through his fingers. But his grandson would become something else entirely, a boy king, a symbol and the centrepiece of one of the most mysterious royal deaths of the entire Middle Ages. The throne stood tall, gilded in gold, polished with centuries of triumph and tragedy. And onto it, in the sweltering summer of 1577, was placed a boy, just 10 years of age, with wide eyes and hands too small for the sceptre they gave him. Richard II. He was the son of the Black Prince, grandson of Edward III, and heir to a kingdom bruised by war, ravaged by plague, and weary from a century of battles abroad. The court dressed in silks, the choirs sang, but beneath the grandeur of the coronation the air was heavy with apprehension. A child now wore the crown, and behind every child king are guardians, some noble, others hungry. Richard's early reign was managed by a council of magnates, including his uncles, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, a formidable presence with a lion's pride, and Thomas of Gloucester, cold and calculating. Each held their own interests. Each circled the throne like patient wolves, waiting for the child to grow or fail. But Richard, even as a boy, possessed a strange gravity. He was not meek nor easily impressed. He believed in the sanctity of kingship, not merely as a position, but as a divine calling. Even in childhood, he seemed set apart, as if he wore the crown not as a burden, but as a birthright no man could touch. Then, just 4 years into his reign, England trembled. In 1381, the ground itself seemed to rise against the crown. The Peasants' Revolt. It began in Essex and Kent, the poorest counties, long crushed by taxation to fund the 100 Years' War. But soon, tens of thousands marched on London, armed not with swords but with fury. They burned manors, tore apart tax records, and swore vengeance on the ruling elite. Their demands were revolutionary: the end of serfdom, fair wages, and justice for the poor. And at the centre of the storm, a boy king stood between chaos and order. The rebels reached London unopposed. The Tower itself was breached. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard's own chancellor, was dragged into the street and beheaded. Heads were placed on pikes. Fires lit the sky. Panic gripped the court. But Richard did not flee. Instead, he rode out, alone, save for a handful of loyalists, to meet the rebels at Mile End. He listened. He nodded. And in a calm, clear voice, he made a promise that echoed like thunder. "You shall have what you seek. I am your king, and I will be your leader." The crowd erupted in cheers. He bought time with words. But the next day, during a second meeting at Smithfield, the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was cut down by the Lord Mayor of London under mysterious circumstances. Chaos threatened to erupt anew, but Richard, just 14, turned to the mob and cried, "I am your king! Follow me!" And they did. The rebellion dissolved, not by force, but by presence. Richard returned to the city a hero. But the promises he made to the people, pardons, freedoms, reforms, were quietly revoked. The vengeance was swift, the mercy a mask. And from that moment on, Richard II believed something deeply, dangerously, that he was not simply king by law, but by destiny. The years that followed were gilded and strange. Richard surrounded himself with art, poets, and scholars. He built elaborate palaces. He wore robes embroidered with golden suns. His court gleamed with pageantry, more theatre than governance. He began to refer to himself in divine terms. Statues of him were raised. He demanded his subjects bow, not merely in respect, but in worship. But kings who dream too brightly often forget the shadows behind them. The nobility grew wary. John of Gaunt, his uncle, his protector, aged, and with his fading strength came new threats. Richard's favourites, men like Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole, were granted titles, wealth, and authority. The lords feeling sidelined saw this as a dangerous corruption. In 1387, a group of powerful nobles known as the Lords Appellant rose in rebellion. They accused Richard's allies of treason and marched on London. The king was forced into submission. His friends were executed, some brutally. Robert de Vere was hunted across the Channel, dying in exile. For a time, Richard ruled under constraint, his crown balanced delicately atop trembling shoulders. But Richard never forgot, nor forgave. In 1397, 10 years later, he struck back. The Lords Appellant were arrested, some executed, others exiled. Parliament was manipulated, judges were bribed. Power, once shared, was now concentrated in Richard's grasp. He ruled not as a king, but as an emperor in miniature. But fate had not yet finished its slow turn. In 1399, John of Gaunt died, and Richard, in a moment of pride and blindness, seized the inheritance meant for Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke. Henry had once been a loyal courtier, a noble knight, but exile had changed him. The theft of his lands sealed his resolve. While Richard was in Ireland suppressing rebellion, Henry returned to England, not as a traitor, but as a rightful heir. The nobles flocked to his side. Richard returned too late. Abandoned by his lords, isolated, stunned by betrayal, he surrendered without a fight. No blood was spilled for the crown this time, just silence. Cold, creeping silence. In September of 1399, Richard II was deposed by Parliament. He stood in Westminster Hall, in robes of state, and placed the crown into Henry's hands. He did not weep, he did not beg. But behind his eyes, witnesses later said there was a fury that burned. Henry IV was crowned. Richard was imprisoned, first in the Tower, then moved quietly to Pontefract Castle. And there, he vanished. No visitors, no messengers, no trial, just a winter of stillness. And in February of 1400, word came. Richard II was dead. Officially, starvation, but he refused to eat. That grief took him like a slow poison. Others say he was murdered, quietly, efficiently, on orders whispered across banquet tables. His body was displayed in St. Paul's Cathedral, pale, thin, a silent warning. He was 33. The boy who had faced an army, the king who believed in divine rule. The ruler who built dreams of gold and saw them sink into mud. Richard II, poet, tyrant, fallen star, and the crown he left behind would rest uneasily on Henry's head, for the usurper's throne is never still, and soon another royal life would hang in the balance, not in prison, but in battle, where father and son would march beneath the same banner, but only one would return. The wind across Shrewsbury was dry and sharp that July in 1403, carrying with it not the smell of wheat or summer fields, but the metal tang of war. Beneath a pale sky, two armies stood ready, Englishmen facing Englishmen, and among them a prince, barely 16, with a sword in his hand and a future balanced upon its edge. But to understand that moment, that flashpoint where loyalty, ambition and blood all met, we must return first to the crown itself and the man who now wore it, Henry IV. He had taken the throne from Richard II not by birthright but by boldness. A usurper, some called him, though few dared say it to his face. His claim was not without merit, but it was not without stain either. He descended from Edward III, yes, but through a junior line. Others had stronger genealogies, but Henry had something they lacked: support. Nobles, soldiers, resolve. His rise had been smooth, his reign would be anything but. From the moment the crown was placed upon his brow, Henry was restless. The throne, so longed for, sat uneasy beneath him. Rebellions flared like embers under dry wood. In Wales, a nobleman named Owain Glyndwr declared himself Prince of Wales, gathering an army of discontented countrymen who struck fast and melted into the hills. In the north, the powerful Percy family, the Earls of Northumberland, grew disillusioned. These were not minor threats. These were men who had once raised Henry to the throne. Now they began to whisper, and soon to move. The Percys, Thomas Percy, Earl of Worcester, his brother Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, and their father, the elder Northumberland, had grown tired of empty promises. They wanted control, autonomy, justice, they claimed, for unpaid soldiers, for neglected alliances, for a realm they had helped win but not been allowed to shape. Hotspur, fierce, reckless and bold, raised his standard in the north. He was just a few years older than Prince Henry, the king's son, but already bathed in the dust of skirmishes and the roar of cavalry. He was beloved by soldiers, feared by enemies, and when he turned against the king, many trembled. The rebellion marched south, joined by Welsh allies and disaffected lords. King Henry moved quickly, drawing forces to meet them near Shrewsbury, and with him rode the Prince of Wales, young Henry, his hair cropped short, his armour still new, but his eyes set with a determination that surprised even his father. The field was dry and flat, flanked by woodland. It was here that the battle began. The fighting was brutal, close. Arrows fell like rain. Men screamed in the high grass. Hotspur's forces surged with desperation, knowing that if they lost here, there would be no second chance. And then, in the thick of battle, a cry rang out that the king was dead. It wasn't true, but for a moment, panic rippled through the royal lines, and into that void stepped the young prince. He led a charge that shattered the rebel flank. He fought beside his men, taking an arrow to the face that pierced his helmet and lodged beneath his eye. Bleeding, staggering, he refused to leave the field. The wound would leave a permanent scar, a mark that never quite faded, no matter how many portraits later tried to smooth it away. As evening fell, Hotspur was struck down. Some say it was an unknown soldier, others as the prince himself. The details are lost, but what remains is this. Hotspur died in the grass, his armour battered, his sword fallen. The rebellion collapsed. After the battle, his body was stripped and displayed, paraded through the north as a warning. The Percy family, once mighty, was broken for now. The king had won, but the prince had been transformed. From that day forward, England saw him not as a boy, but as a warrior, a leader, a king in waiting. Yet beneath the glory of Shrewsbury, shadows still gathered. King Henry IV, though triumphant, began to suffer strange afflictions. He was only in his late 30s, but his health failed rapidly. He was plagued by mysterious illnesses, perhaps leprosy, perhaps a skin disease, perhaps something worse. His face became disfigured. He withdrew from court, hiding his pain behind veils and silence. At times he collapsed mid-council. At others he disappeared entirely, leaving the business of kingship to his son. There were seizures, hallucinations, sudden rages, and moments of eerie calm. His enemies whispered of divine punishment, that he had stolen the crown from Richard II, and the heavens would not forgive him, that the illness was not of the flesh but of the soul. In 1413, during Lent, he collapsed before the shrine of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. He was taken to the Jerusalem chamber, a place he believed had been prophesied as the site of his death. There, surrounded by clergy and cold stone, he lingered for days. His son came to him, now a man, now ready. Henry IV took his last breath in silence. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral beside his second wife, Joan of Navarre, not in the splendour of Westminster, but in a quieter, more humble tomb. He was 45, the man who had deposed a king, who had fought his own allies, who had worn the crown in defiance of blood and prophecy, now lay still, forgotten by the realm he had ruled in fire and iron. And his son, Prince Henry, now became king. Henry V, a warrior, a hero, a legend in waiting. But ahead of him lay a campaign of ambition so great, it would shake 2 kingdoms, and in its wake, death would ride again, not from sword or plague, but from a whisper in the night, in a chamber lined with velvet and betrayal. The year was 1413, and the sky above Westminster Abbey was choked with a cold, wet fog as bells tolled for a new king. The streets of London were slick with rain, and yet the crowd still gathered. They pressed into one another beneath wool cloaks and damp caps, craning to see a figure who, not long ago, had been a wayward prince, scarred, wild, and whisper-rumoured. But now he was Henry IV. And as he stepped through the Abbey's great doors on the day of his coronation, the torches flickering against the stone, something about him had changed. His jaw was set, his gaze steady. He wore his crown not as a burden, but as a sword, a man reborn. Gone were the drinking halls and the laughter of youth. Gone were the masked revels, the rowdy nights in Eastcheap, the company of low-born friends. Prince Hal, the boisterous companion of scoundrels, was dead. In his place stood a king forged of silence and discipline. The ceremony, rich with incense and solemnity, marked more than a transition of power. It marked a rupture in the story of the Plantagenets. Henry was not a cautious ruler, nor one to be pulled by factions. He was singular, precise, and possessed of a hunger few could see, the hunger to finish what his forebears had started. France. It had haunted English kings for generations. The dream of dominion across the Channel, the legacy of Edward III's claim, the echo of Agincourt's elder cousin, Cressy. Henry V believed that dream could be made flesh once more. But war requires coin, soldiers, ships, unity. So before Henry raised his banner, he turned inward. His reign began with order. Criminals were punished, debts collected, taxes, high but lawful, were levied with sharp clarity. Nobles who had grown too bold under his ailing father were summoned and reminded, in no uncertain terms, that the crown now sat on steadier shoulders. But not all were content to bow. Among the discontented was Richard of Conisburg, Earl of Cambridge, cousin to the king and son of Edmund of Langley, one of Edward III's younger sons. Richard had royal blood. He also had ambition and ties to the Mortimer claim, a rival line descended from Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp. Together with Lord Scrope and Sir Thomas Grey, Cambridge plotted. Their goal was simple: assassinate Henry V at Southampton, just days before he sailed for France, and place the young Edmund Mortimer on the throne. It was bold. It was also doomed. The conspiracy unravelled with eerie speed. Some say it was betrayed from within. Others claim Henry knew long before and waited, letting the net draw tight. Either way, by early August 1415, the traitors were seized. No delay, no ceremony. Cambridge, a royal cousin, was executed like a common criminal. And with that, the message was clear: treason would find no mercy. With England now firmly in his grip, Henry turned his gaze to France. That autumn, his army crossed the Channel, a force of perhaps 12,000, hardened and trained. They besieged Harfleur first, battering its walls until they cracked. But disease took hold. Dysentery, known then as the bloody flux, tore through the camps. Hundreds died. Still, Henry pressed on. With fewer than 10,000 men, he began a long march through the French countryside, aiming to return to Calais. His army was starving, sick and soaked by October rains. French forces gathered, tens of thousands, outnumbering him at least 4-1. They met at Agincourt, a narrow field between woods, mud thick as glue, and an English army exhausted, hemmed in. But Henry knew how to use the land. He placed his longbowmen behind stakes, arranged his men tightly. And then in the chill of the morning, the French charged. The rest became legend. Armour sank into the mud, horses flailed, arrows fell in waves. The French elite, weighed down by their own pride, was slaughtered. It was not simply victory, it was devastation. Thousands of French knights died. The English losses? Barely a few hundred. Henry, once dismissed as a youthful wastrel, returned home a hero, a conqueror. A king of steel and scripture, the bells of London rang for days. And yet, beneath the hymns and flowers, shadows gathered, because France was not yet won. Over the next years, Henry returned again and again, carving through Normandy, taking Rouen, reducing towns to submission. He moved not with rage, but with ruthless efficiency. Castles fell, armies surrendered, diplomacy followed. And in 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed. It was a triumph of cunning and force. The French king, Charles VI, broken by madness, recognised Henry as his heir. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was disinherited. To seal the treaty, Henry married Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, young, soft-voiced and politically perfect. Now, Henry was not just King of England, he was heir to France. The dream was real. But dreams are fragile. In the summer of 1422, as he campaigned deep in the French countryside, a fever began to burn through Henry's body. Some say it was dysentery, others typhoid. The heat did not break. His strength failed, his skin turned pale, then grey. He was just 35. His final days were spent in Vincennes, a fortress near Paris, surrounded not by battle banners but by silence. He asked for his son, an infant not yet a year old, but the child was in England. The message never reached in time. Henry V died with no final embrace, no battlefield, no music, just candlelight. And so the crown passed again. This time to a baby. King Henry VI, barely 9 months old, now ruled 2 kingdoms. But this child would not become a warrior. His fate would be far stranger, far sadder, for his reign would not end in glory or fire, but in madness and in murder, and in a queen's desperate hand clawing at fate as the walls closed in. The bells that tolled for Henry V in 1422 were muffled beneath the weight of awe and dread. Across England and France, messengers rode to proclaim the news. The warrior king was dead. In his place, an infant now held the titles of 2 realms. Barely able to speak, unable to walk, the boy had inherited a legacy steeped in blood, conquest, and impossible expectation. Henry VI, he was crowned twice, once in Westminster at the age of 8, then again in Notre Dame de Paris at 10, 2 crowns, 2 kingdoms, 1 child. But the world would learn, slowly and painfully, that this boy was not like the men who came before him. He was gentle, prayerful, pale and slender, with a soft voice and downcast eyes. He preferred cloisters to courts, silence to ceremony. He loved books, not banners, chapels, not campaigns. Where his father had carved an empire with blade and flame, Henry VI ruled with whispers and parchment. The court, at first, wrapped him in protection. Regents governed in his stead: Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester in England, John, Duke of Bedford in France. They fought to preserve what Henry V had built, the crumbling edge of Plantagenet dominance on the continent. But even as they held back the French, a new force began to rise. Not a general, not a prince, a peasant girl, Joan of Arc. She claimed visions from saints. She claimed France would be reborn, and though many mocked her, dismissed her, even feared her, they could not ignore her. In 1429, she rode to Orleans, a city under siege, and broke the English lines. It was not just a military victory, it was a miracle in armour. Joan's triumph revived the French spirit. Her presence turned the tide. That same year, Charles VII, the disinherited Dauphin, was crowned at Reims. The myth of English destiny shattered. Bedford struggled to hold the line. Joan was captured in 1430 and handed over to the English. They put her on trial, condemning her not as a soldier, but as a heretic. The proceedings were cruel, the verdict predetermined. In 1431, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. She was 19, and though her ashes scattered in the Seine, her death did not save the English cause. The French pressed harder, towns fell, alliances shifted, Bedford died, Gloucester quarrelled with Cardinal Beaufort, the king's other great uncle. And above it all, Henry VI watched, or perhaps drifted. By the mid-1440s, he was of age, but not of command. He married Margaret of Anjou, a young French noblewoman, intelligent, proud and politically sharp. She came not with dowry, but with demands. To secure peace, Henry ceded Maine and Anjou to the French, lands hard won by his father. The nobles were furious. England's treasury groaned. Corruption spread like mould. Power began to consolidate around a man named William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, a favourite of the king and despised by nearly everyone else. Henry, passive, watched, and the war, despite diplomacy, sputtered on. In 1450, Normandy was lost. English soldiers, once feared, were driven into the sea. The people, enraged by humiliation and hardship, erupted. In Kent, a rebellion rose under Jack Cade, a clerk claiming noble blood. His army stormed London, demanding justice. Though Cade was slain, the message was clear. The people were done waiting. In the shadows of court, another figure gathered strength: Richard, Duke of York. Descended from both Edward III's second and fourth sons, his claim to the throne rivaled Henry's own. At first, he presented himself as a reformer, but ambition is seldom so simple. And then the king broke. In 1453, news arrived of another crushing loss in France, the Battle of Castillon. The last English foothold in Guienne was gone. Bordeaux had fallen, the war was over, and England had lost. It was too much. Something inside Henry fractured. He fell into a trance-like silence. He recognised no one, not his wife, not his courtiers. He did not speak, he did not move. For over a year he remained in that state, still breathing, still watching, but empty. During his illness, Queen Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster. But whispers already moved like wind through stone halls. Was the child truly Henry's? Richard of York seized the moment. He was named Lord Protector. The realm tilted toward him. Factions formed, those loyal to the king and queen, and those loyal to York. And when Henry awoke, he awoke into civil war. The Wars of the Roses, Lancaster versus York, red rose versus white, a crown balanced on a sword's edge. Henry tried to hold the centre, but he was no longer trusted. His moments of lucidity came and went. At times he wept during council meetings. At others he stared into nothingness, while enemies gathered at his door. In 1460, the Duke of York was slain in battle, but his son Edward took up the cause. Young, charismatic, ruthless. In 1461, after victory at Teuton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, Edward declared himself king. Henry fled. He wandered, a shadow of a monarch, through the north. Captured. Released. Captured again, his robes now rags, his court now caves, and still Margaret fought, leading armies in his name. In 1470, by some twist of politics and treachery, Henry was briefly restored to the throne, but the world had changed. The next year, Edward IV returned with an army. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, Margaret's forces were crushed. Her son, the Prince Edward of Westminster, was slain. Some say in battle, others say murdered after surrender. Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and there, on a quiet night in May of 1471, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause? Melancholy. Grief. But few believed it. More likely he was murdered, quietly, by dagger or poison, on orders not written but understood. He was 50 years old, the pious king, the mad king, the broken vessel into which an empire had been poured and shattered. They buried him at Chertsey Abbey, later moving his remains to Windsor. And though no monument was built to his greatness, pilgrims came, whispered prayers, lit candles, for he had never been cruel, only cursed. And the war that swallowed him would not end with his death, because now another king wore the crown, one with blood on his hands and ambition still to feed. But even he would not escape the silence waiting at the end of a hallway, where two boys vanished forever. The Tower of London, massive and unyielding, loomed over the Thames like a stone sentinel. Its white walls caught the morning mist, its turrets silent, its courtyards echoing with secrets. For centuries it had been a fortress, a palace, and, more often than not, a prison. And it was within those cold, ancient walls that two boys once lived and disappeared. But before the darkness swallowed them, there was triumph. Edward IV had claimed the crown in the chaos of civil war. A Yorkist king, bold and brilliant, he ruled with a commanding presence and a taste for luxury. Handsome, tall, and utterly confident, he had once carved his path through the battlefield with the ease of a lion through tall grass. Yet behind the pageantry, the dances, and the golden laughter, shadows lengthened. He had seized the throne from Henry VI twice. And though Henry was now gone and the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, had been struck down at Tewkesbury, Edward IV was never truly at peace, for a king who takes a crown by force must hold it by fear. He ruled England for over a decade, consolidating power, rewarding allies, and marrying, not with caution, but with defiance. Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, a widow, a woman of remarkable beauty and ambition, their secret marriage scandalized the court. She was not the French princess his advisors had planned for. She came with no dowry, no alliance, only a large family and a quiet, calculating mind. Edward made her queen, and with her came the Woodvilles. Brothers, sisters, cousins, all drawn into royal orbit. Titles were granted, marriages arranged, influence bloomed. But resentment followed. The old nobility, especially the king's own brothers, watched with growing bitterness. Among them was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest of Edward's surviving brothers. Small of stature, serious and unsmiling, Richard was everything Edward was not. Pious, reserved, and loyal, or so it seemed. He had fought beside Edward in war, had bled for him, but as the Woodvilles rose, Richard remained on the margins, his lands confined to the north, his role increasingly ceremonial. Then, in April of 1483, Edward IV, still in the prime of life, collapsed. Some said it was pneumonia, others a stroke or the long consequences of a life too richly lived. He had grown heavier in recent years, his face more drawn. The court physicians murmured of ulcers, of fevers, of drink. Whatever the cause, death came swiftly. He was 40. And with him gone, the realm again shuddered, for his eldest son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, was only 12. Too young to rule alone, too young to hold a kingdom filled with wolves. Edward IV had named his brother, Richard of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. It seemed a wise choice. Richard was proven, experienced, and of royal blood. The council accepted it. The Queen, though cautious, bowed to it. But she did not trust him. When her son, the new King Edward V, was summoned from Ludlow to London for his coronation, Elizabeth Woodville hesitated. She tried to gather her remaining children around her. She fled with her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. But Gloucester moved quickly. He intercepted the boy king along the road, accompanied by a small escort of Woodville allies. Richard arrested the boy's guardians and escorted the young king to London, not to the palace, but to the Tower. He claimed it was for Edward's safety, and there the boy waited, not for danger but for a crown. At first, preparations continued. The coronation was scheduled, robes were measured, nobles were summoned, but behind the scenes Richard made his move. Rumours spread that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, that he had been betrothed to another woman before her. If true, their children were illegitimate, unable to inherit the throne. A preacher at Richard's behest declared this publicly. Then Parliament, through a document called Titulus Regius, confirmed it. Edward V was no longer king. Richard of Gloucester was crowned instead. Richard III. The two boys, Edward and his younger brother, were still housed in the tower. They were last seen playing in the gardens, glimpsed by servants, their silhouettes at a window. Then, nothing. No announcement, no procession, just silence. The guards changed, the windows darkened, and slowly the world understood. They were gone. Whispers turned to theories. Some said Richard III had ordered deaths, suffocated in their sleep, buried beneath stairs. Others claimed the Duke of Buckingham or even Henry Tudor was responsible. A few dared to hope the boys had escaped, living on in secrecy, hidden by allies. But the years passed. No evidence emerged, only bones, centuries later found beneath a staircase in the tower, small, tangled, anonymous. Richard III denied any wrongdoing, but his crown, from the moment he placed it on his head, was stained. He ruled only briefly, haunted by suspicion, isolated by mistrust, and from across the sea, a rival waited. Henry Tudor, a descendant of the Lancastrian line, prepared to return, and in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he struck. Richard fought valiantly. He led the final charge himself, his crown fixed to his helmet, his blade drawn. He cut through Henry's guards, almost reached him, but was surrounded, cut down, slain in mud and blood, the last Plantagenet king. His body was stripped, slung over a horse and buried in an unmarked grave, his crown taken, his name cursed or pitied, and the princes? Still gone. 2 boys, 1 tower, no answers. Just the silence of a locked door and the soft rustle of linen as someone one night pulled the blanket a little higher over a sleeping face, then pressed down. The field at Bosworth lay still in the hours after battle, the smoke drifting low over trampled grass and blood-wet earth. The clash of steel, the cries of dying men, the roar of war horses, all faded into silence, leaving only the crows and the distant sound of men searching the fallen. Among them, stripped of armour, bruised and broken, lay the body of a king. Richard III. The last of the Plantagenets. He had gone down fighting, a crown riveted to his helm, charging toward Henry Tudor with desperate courage. But valour could not stop betrayal. Lord Stanley, whose allegiance had wavered like a reed in wind, had turned the tide at the final moment, throwing his weight behind the upstart from across the sea. And with Richard's death, the Plantagenet line died too, or so the world believed. Henry Tudor, now Henry VI, stood over the battlefield that evening and saw his future paved in blood. He had no direct claim as strong as those he had defeated, but history is written not in claims but in victory, and victory that day was his. To seal his fragile grasp on the throne, he made a promise. He would marry Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. York and Lancaster united, red rose and white rose bound into one, and he did. In January of 1486 they wed, and in September of that same year she gave birth to a son, Arthur. It was a name not chosen by accident. The Tudors, new and vulnerable, leaned on myth. Arthur, the once and future king, the ruler of legend, returned to bring unity and glory. In naming their heir thus, Henry and Elizabeth reached not into the past of England, but into its dreams. The boy was raised as the embodiment of promise, bright, gentle, pious, and groomed from his earliest days to rule. Tutors praised his intellect, courtiers admired his grace, and by the age of 11 he was engaged to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's most powerful monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. The alliance was strategic, but the bond between Arthur and Catherine was, by many accounts, warm. They wrote to one another in Latin, they shared music, poetry, and long walks beneath the English skies. In November of 1501 they married in a dazzling ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. The city celebrated with feasts and pageantry, trumpets sounded, bells rang. It was said the Tudor future had never looked brighter. But winter can be cruel. Less than 5 months later, the newlyweds travelled to Ludlow Castle, Arthur's seat, as Prince of Wales. It was a stately place in the borderlands, windswept and far from court. There, in April of 1502, illness came. It arrived without warning, sweating sickness, perhaps, or consumption, or something unnamed. The records are vague, but it struck fast and struck both. Catherine survived. Arthur did not. He died in a chamber heavy with candle smoke and whispered prayers, his dreams extinguished at only 15. The heir to England, the hope of the dynasty, gone. The shock rippled through the kingdom. Henry VII was said to be inconsolable. Elizabeth of York, the Queen, collapsed in grief, and Catherine, barely 16, alone in a foreign land, was widowed before she had become a wife in full. She claimed the marriage had never been consummated. The court accepted this, or chose to, but grief left deeper cracks. A year later, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, hoping perhaps to heal the wound left by Arthur's passing, but the baby died shortly after birth. And then within days, so did Elizabeth. She was only 37. The white rose, joined to the red, had withered. Henry VII never recovered. He aged rapidly, grew paranoid, reclusive. The court, once adorned with celebration, turned austere. He counted coins, locked doors, watched his remaining son, Henry, with wary eyes. This boy, Henry, was never meant to rule. He had been the spare, the second son, playful, tall, athletic. He had trained for the church, not the crown, but now he became the future. Catherine of Aragon remained at court in quiet limbo, a Spanish princess once destined to be queen, now a widow in mourning. She wrote letters to her father, prayed, waited, and Henry II plotted. He did not wish to return her dowry, nor did he wish to lose the alliance with Spain. So he petitioned the Pope for a dispensation, one that would allow Catherine to marry his second son, her former brother-in-law. It was granted, but the marriage would not occur under Henry VII's watch. He died in 1509, aged 52, after a reign marked more by caution than courage. And so once again a crown passed to a boy. But this time not a child of fragility or piety. Henry VIII, just 17, stepped into the role with the confidence of a prince born for pleasure. He married Catherine almost immediately, and with her hand he inherited not just a throne, but a prophecy unspoken, that the Tudor line, born of blood and fear, could not endure peace. And in Henry, the flame of violence would burn again, not in battle, but in marriage. And one by one, queens would fall, not by arrow, not by sword, but by a cold whisper. Execute her. The court of King Henry VIII glittered like no other before it. In the spring of 1509, London rejoiced. Banners streamed from high windows, musicians filled the palace halls with bright harmonies. The new king, tall, broad-shouldered, radiant with youth, was everything his father had not been. Charming, athletic, fluent in languages, generous with praise and spectacle. The people adored him. He was 25 years younger than the queen he inherited, Catherine of Aragon. She had waited patiently through the long, anxious years of Henry VII's rule, her future uncertain, her dowry questioned, her value reduced to politics. But now she was queen, crowned alongside Henry, applauded, respected, and loved. At first, for the first years of their marriage, Henry and Catherine were devoted. She was wise, gracious, and grounded in faith. He was eager to please, parading her beside him, writing songs in her honour, defending her against those who murmured about her age, her Spanish manner, her uncertain fertility. Because Catherine's womb, though celebrated with each royal pregnancy, became a place of mourning. She conceived many times, but each time the child slipped away. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who breathed but never thrived. Only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. A girl. The disappointment was never spoken aloud at court, but it lingered in the silences between royal feasts, in the hushed tones of midwives, in the dry eyes of a king who had begun to feel the pinch of fate. Henry wanted a son, needed one, for he feared what all Tudors feared, the curse of uncertainty. A crown passed to a child was a kingdom torn in two, and he, though beloved and mighty, could not escape the fear of extinction. And so he began to look elsewhere. It started with glances, then gifts, then nights in private chambers. Mistresses came and went. Henry Fitzroy, a bastard son by one of them, was born in 1519. The king loved him dearly, even considered legitimising him. But it was not enough. By the late 1520s, a new face had emerged at court. Not beautiful in the traditional sense, but captivating. Dark eyes, quick wit, a sharp tongue wrapped in charm. Anne Boleyn. She was no naive girl. She had spent years at the French court, learning its games, its subtle cruelties. She knew power when she saw it, and she would not be a mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to set aside his queen. But Catherine would not go quietly. She was devout, a daughter of Catholic monarchs, the widow of Henry's brother, and she insisted fiercely that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Therefore, she claimed her union with Henry was lawful. Holy, Henry disagreed. He petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment. He argued that his marriage was cursed, that he had sinned by marrying his brother's widow, and that God had punished them with childlessness. The Pope hesitated. Political tides shifted. Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had recently invaded Rome. The Pope, now effectively his prisoner, dared not offend him by discarding his aunt. Years passed. Henry raged. Anne waited. The court split into factions. Scholars debated. Ambassadors whispered. And beneath it all, the king's patience thinned like ice beneath a warming sun. In 1533, he broke from Rome. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, granted the annulment. Henry married Anne, privately first, then publicly. Catherine was cast aside, her titles stripped, her rooms emptied. She never saw her daughter again. Mary, once the cherished princess, was declared illegitimate, sent away, forgotten by her father. Catherine lived the rest of her life in isolation. She wrote letters, prayed, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen. She signed herself Queen of England until the end. In 1536, she died, likely of cancer, alone in Kimbolton Castle. She was 50. The court barely mourned. Henry wore yellow the day her death was announced, the colour of joy in Spanish mourning custom, though some said he simply wished to mark a turning of the page. But the shadow of her passing would not fade. Anne, crowned in triumph, now stood in Catherine's place, and for a moment Henry believed his fortune had turned. Anne gave birth to a child in September 1533, a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but patient. More children would come, surely, more sons. They did not. Anne miscarried. Once, twice. Then, in January of 1536, she lost a child believed to be male, her final chance and her final protection. Henry had already begun to turn toward another. Jane Seymour, pale and modest, with a quiet smile and no past scandals. She offered not temptation, but stability. Anne's enemies gathered. Charges were fabricated: adultery, incest, treason. She was accused of betraying the king with multiple men, including her own brother. There was no proof. There were no fair trials, only a script written in haste. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked barefoot to the scaffold at the Tower of London. She wore a grey gown, her hair pinned beneath a French hood. She knelt calmly, spoke softly of her innocence, and waited for the sword. It came from France, a clean blade, wielded by an expert executioner. With a single stroke, her head was taken. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor. She was 35, queen, mother, martyr, pawn. And Elizabeth, her daughter, now joined Mary in shame, another bastard child of a discarded wife. Henry remarried just 10 days later. Jane Seymour would give him a son. But the death of queens had only just begun, for behind each woman's eyes Henry saw not love, but legacy. And legacy to a Tudor was worth any price. The bells of St. Paul's rang again, though not for mourning. This time they rang for joy. In May of 1536, just days after the swift execution of Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII took another bride, his third. Jane Seymour, fair-haired and reserved, was the opposite of Anne in almost every way. She was modest where Anne had been bold, quiet where Anne had been sharp. She had waited patiently at court, avoiding scandal, playing the role of dutiful lady-in-waiting, until her moment came, and when it did, she became queen. The court breathed easier. Jane did not provoke or polarize. She did not interfere in politics. She showed kindness to Henry's daughters, especially Mary, whose mother had been her former mistress. Quietly, she encouraged reconciliation, a rare, gentle presence in a court that had become accustomed to thunder. But her true value to Henry lay in something else entirely. In October of 1537, after over a year of marriage, Jane went into labour. It was a long, agonising ordeal. 3 days and 3 nights of pain as the court waited outside and Henry paced the halls of Hampton Court Palace. At last the child was born, a son, Edward, a prince, a Tudor heir. Trumpets were sounded, bonfires lit across the land. At last, the prophecy of Henry's reign seemed fulfilled. The fear of succession, of instability, of war, all eased in that single moment. Henry wept. He held the child in his arms, this small, wriggling, red-faced boy, and saw in him the future. Everything he had lost, everything he had done, was justified by this child. But joy would not last. Within days of the birth, Jane began to sicken. She developed a fever, her skin turned pale, her breathing grew ragged. She was slipping, drained from the labour, overtaken by infection. The king was devastated. He ordered constant prayers, called the best physicians, but there was nothing they could do. 12 days after giving birth to the son Henry had longed for, Jane Seymour died. She was 28. Henry wore black. He shut himself away for days, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. In the years that followed, he would call her his true wife, the only one he believed gave him what he needed, a male heir. She would be the only queen buried beside him. But though Jane was gone, the machinery of kingship ground on. Edward, still swaddled in his cradle, was named Prince of Wales. Servants hovered over him, tutors were selected. A nursery was constructed with precision and care. Henry, meanwhile, remained unmarried, but not for long. In 1540, he agreed to another match, Anne of Cleves, a German princess. The alliance was political, meant to strengthen ties with Protestant states against the threat of Catholic powers. A portrait of Anne, painted by Hans Holbein, pleased the king. She seemed suitable, if not inspiring, but when she arrived in England, Henry was appalled. He found her unattractive, dull. "I like her not," he famously declared. Their marriage, awkward from the start, was never consummated. Within 6 months, it was annulled on grounds of non-consummation and her pre-contract with another noble. Anne, pragmatic, accepted the outcome. She was granted lands, a pension, and the honorary title of King's Sister. She remained in England, quietly wealthy, untouched by scandal. And then came Catherine Howard. She was young, just a teenager, cousin to Anne Boleyn, full of laughter, flirtation, and charm. Henry, now aged, bloated, and often suffering from an infected leg ulcer that left him in agony, was besotted. He lavished her with jewels, silks, and praise. He called her his rose without a thorn. But thorns, of course, were hidden in the petals. Whispers reached the king that she had not been chaste before marriage, that she had been involved with Francis Derriam, a former household servant, that she had taken Thomas Culpeper, one of Henry's own gentlemen, as a lover even after becoming queen. An investigation began. Love curdled to rage. Catherine was arrested, interrogated. She confessed to nothing at first, but the evidence piled high. Her past, letters, testimonies, illicit meetings, was laid bare. She was stripped of her titles, confined in her chambers, and eventually moved to the Tower of London. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, she was led to the scaffold. Barely 20, she trembled. She asked for the executioner's forgiveness, and before kneeling, she spoke clearly that she died a queen, but wished to die as the wife of Thomas Culpeper. The blade fell. Another wife erased, another ghost in the king's chamber. And Henry, now aging rapidly, became a shadow of the man who once dazzled the world. His once vibrant eyes dulled. His frame grew enormous. His leg, still ulcerated, festered and bled. He moved with difficulty. His temper flared without warning. He trusted few, smiled rarely. Yet still, he married once more Catherine Parr, his 6th wife. A widow twice over, learned and wise, she nursed the king in his decline. She reunited his children, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, bringing them briefly under one roof. She read to him, prayed with him. She survived him. In January of 1547, Henry VIII died. He was 55, massive, sick, and tyrannised by his own fear of mortality. He was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle beside Jane Seymour, the queen who gave him the son he so desperately wanted. The others, forgotten or destroyed. 6 queens, 2 executed, 2 discarded, 1 dead in childbirth, 1 outlived him, each a mirror to Henry's shifting desires, beauty, alliance, obedience, legacy. But his legacy was fragile. His son Edward VI was just 9, a king once more in the hands of others, and his daughters, one Catholic, one Protestant, would soon clash in ways that tore the kingdom apart. For though Henry had taken many lives, his greatest death blow was to peace itself. When the great doors of Westminster Abbey opened once more in the winter of 1547, the crown passed again, but this time to a child. Edward VI, just 9 years old, was led down the nave beneath an iron-grey sky. The scent of frankincense clung to the air. His robes were heavy, the sword at his waist, ceremonial, dragged slightly against the floor. Small hands held the orb and sceptre, symbols far grander than the boy who bore them. But to the realm, he was more than a boy. He was a promise, the son of Jane Seymour, the only legitimate male heir of Henry VIII. Raised in Protestant conviction, brought up among tutors who had filled his young mind with scripture and reform, order and godliness. Yet a child cannot rule alone. And so the kingdom fell into the hands of guardians. The first among them, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the new king's uncle. Named Lord Protector, Somerset held power with confident urgency. He believed in the Reformation, in the future, in the moulding of England into a Protestant nation, purified and reformed. Churches were stripped of relics and statues. Latin Mass was replaced by English services. A new prayer book, gentle in tone but radical in impact, swept across the parishes. But the cost of reform was not only spiritual. The countryside trembled. Enclosures, the fencing of common lands, left peasants desperate. Food grew scarce. Uprisings ignited. In Norfolk, a man named Robert Kett led thousands in revolt demanding justice. Somerset suppressed them with fire, with blood. But the damage had been done. He had lost the nobles' trust. In 1549, Somerset was overthrown by a coup from within the council. He was imprisoned, released, then imprisoned again. In 1552, accused of conspiracy, he was executed on Tower Hill. His head fell in silence. His nephew, the king, watched from a distance. Power then shifted to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. More shrewd than zealous, Northumberland understood one truth. The king's health was fading. Edward was never strong. Pale and slender like his mother, he suffered from fevers, a persistent cough, and a creeping, consuming weakness. By early 1553, he was dying. The doctors called it consumption, tuberculosis. And with no brothers, no sons of his own, the question of succession returned, grim and urgent. By law, the crown should pass to Mary, Edward's elder half-sister. A Catholic, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the embodiment of everything Edward's reforms had fought against. He could not allow it. And so, under Northumberland's guidance, a new plan emerged. Lady Jane Grey. A granddaughter of Henry VII through his younger daughter, Jane was a Tudor by blood and a Protestant by conviction. More importantly, she was married to Northumberland's own son, Guildford Dudley. A delicate string, pulled carefully. Edward, frail and fading, signed the device for the succession, naming Jane as his heir. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died. He was 15. His reign, though short, had transformed the Church of England, but his final act had plunged the country into chaos. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. For 9 days she was 17. She did not seek the crown. She wept when it was offered, but duty and family pressed her forward. She entered the Tower of London as monarch, receiving pledges of loyalty, coins minted with her face. But beyond the city walls, Mary Tudor was moving. She raised support in East Anglia. Thousands gathered. Nobles defected. The people, weary of upheaval, rallied behind the daughter Catherine, the princess so long wronged. In less than 2 weeks, Mary entered London in triumph. Jane was arrested, her crown revoked, her name struck from history. At first, Mary was merciful. She kept Jane imprisoned in the Tower, offering her safety if she recounted her Protestant faith. Jane, gentle but resolute, refused. She read her Bible daily, wrote letters of quiet dignity, awaited her fate. But rebellion returned. In early 1554, Thomas Wyatt the Younger led an uprising against Mary, protesting her decision to marry Philip of Spain, fearing foreign rule and Catholic retribution. Though Jane had no part in it, her name was whispered once more as a figurehead for Protestant hope. And so Mary signed the order. On the morning of February 12th, 1554, Lady Jane Grey was led from her cell to the scaffold within the Tower grounds. She wore a black gown, her hair unbound. She carried a prayer book in her hands. She spoke calmly, asking only for forgiveness and prayers. She was blindfolded, and in the final moment she stumbled. "I pray you, dispatch me quickly," she whispered. The axe fell. She was buried nearby, in the chapel where Anne Boleyn lay, queen for 9 days, dead before 18. Mary Tudor ruled now, and her crown, though earned, was not at peace. For Mary would soon find herself haunted, not by ghosts but by fire, by the smoke of pyres, by cries in the marketplace, by the name they would give her, Bloody Mary. The iron keys turned in the tower's great doors again, this time not to release, but to remember. A queen had died within those walls, young Jane Grey, with her soft voice and folded prayers, but the new queen had no interest in martyrs. She had inherited a throne bruised by rebellion, split by faith and shadowed by doubt, yet Mary Tudor stood in defiance of it all. At 37, she was no naive girl. She was a survivor, shaped by abandonment, humiliation, and long, bitter years of uncertainty, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and now Queen of England. She was the first woman to rule England in her own right, not through marriage, not through regency, but by birth and law. And with that crown came her vow to restore what her father had torn apart. The Catholic faith. Her coronation in October of 1553 was solemn, rich with incense and Latin rites. The court shimmered in velvet and gold. But behind the chants and organ hymns, tension curled like smoke. England had grown used to change, not comforted by it, but weary. The people knelt, but they also watched. Would this queen heal or punish? At first, Mary showed restraint. She reversed Edward's reforms, restored papal authority, repealed Protestant laws. She welcomed exiled bishops back to their pulpits. Her cousin, Reginald Pole, returned from Rome to become Archbishop of Canterbury. But change was not enough. Revenge, perhaps, waited in the corners of her heart, not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. Mary believed her soul and her kingdoms were at risk of eternal damnation, and what followed was not policy, it was purification. Heretics, she called them. In February of 1555, the burnings began. The first was John Rogers, a biblical translator. Then came bishops, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley. They were tied to wooden stakes in Oxford, firewood piled at their feet. Latimer, flames licking at his robes, cried out to his fellow martyr, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." The crowds watched in silence. Then came Thomas Cranmer, the very man who had annulled her mother's marriage, who had crowned her half-sister Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. He recanted, then recounted his recantation. He too was burned. One by one, they perished. Over 280 Protestants across 3 years, men, women, the elderly. Some wept, some prayed, some sang hymns as the fire consumed them. They died in marketplaces, at crossroads, outside cathedrals, their ashes scattered by wind and rain. And so Mary earned the name she never sought, Bloody Mary. But while her enemies burned, her own body withered. She had married Philip of Spain in 1554, a union meant to cement Catholic power, to produce heirs to bind England and Spain. Philip was formal, distant, and soon gone, returning to the continent while Mary dreamed of children. She believed she was pregnant, her belly swelled, her appetite changed, she withdrew from court, preparing for birth. A nursery was readied, prayers of thanksgiving drafted, but no child came. Months passed. Her body slowly deflated. The truth, whispered by maids, murmured by physicians, could not be denied. There was no child, no heir. Only hope turned to shame, and it happened again, a second phantom pregnancy, a second retreat. This time, no celebration accompanied her isolation, just silence. Her stomach grew, then flattened, her eyes dulled, her health began to falter. The throne stood on uncertain ground. With no heir of her own, Mary was forced to consider the one person she feared and resented most. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the girl Henry VIII had once declared illegitimate, a Protestant, and yet her sister. At times Mary considered removing her, imprisoning her again, executing her as others had urged. But something stayed her hand, perhaps memory, perhaps conscience, or perhaps the understanding that death, already close, would soon decide what Mary could not. In November of 1558, Mary Tudor lay in a bed at St. James's Palace. She was weak, racked by fevers. Her voice, once firm in court and cruel in Parliament, had grown soft. She asked for Philip. He never came. She asked for prayers, for forgiveness, for peace. And on the morning of November 17th, she died. She was 42. Her body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, beneath a Latin inscription praising her as Queen of England and France. Years later, Elizabeth would be buried in the same tomb above her, and a new inscription would be carved over both. Partners in throne and grave, here rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection. But in life, they had never been partners. Mary ruled with fire, Elizabeth would rule with light, and as the torches of Mary's reign dimmed, a new flame was kindled, red-haired, brilliant and watchful, a queen who would outlast them all. But even her reign, golden as it would seem, would be stained with betrayal and end in death. Not hers, but her cousin's. The wind off the Thames carried the scent of wet stone and wood smoke, as once again the bells tolled over London. It was not a dirge this time, but a song of transition, solemn and bright. For Mary Tudor was dead, and in her place rose her sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. The girl once branded a bastard, the woman who now stepped through the doors of Westminster Abbey, not as an heir in question, but as a monarch without equal. She was 25 years old, tall, poised, and crowned with a mane of red gold hair that caught every glint of torchlight. Her face, pale and expressive, carried the careful mask of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of suspicion. She had survived her mother's fall, her father's wrath, her sister's prison. She stood alone. At last, Queen of England, she knew the dangers. A realm divided by religion, a court still riddled with factions, foreign powers watching, waiting. And above all, the question that haunted every conversation, every letter, every eye that followed her as she walked: whom would she marry? She did not answer, not at first, not for years. Instead, she ruled. She re-established the Church of England, a compromise, not entirely Protestant, not wholly Catholic, but something in between. Her advisors called it the Elizabethan settlement. It soothed some, infuriated others, but it held, and the people, they began to love her. She walked among them, toured the countryside, gave speeches that swelled with fire and charm. She laughed, danced, flirted, played the part of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, married not to a man but to her country. But power, for all its trappings, is never secure. In the shadows of Europe, eyes burned with envy and fear. Spain, France, the papacy, all watched the woman they considered a heretic. And at home, some watched her not as a queen, but as an obstacle. For across the narrow sea, in the damp greenness of Scotland, there lived another queen. Younger, Catholic, regal by birth and beloved by many, Mary, Queen of Scots. She was Elizabeth's cousin, granddaughter of Henry VII through his eldest daughter, a more legitimate Tudor, some whispered, a more proper heir. And she, unlike Elizabeth, had borne a child, a son, James. Mary's life had been a storm of scandal and suspicion. Widowed young in France, married again in Scotland, her second husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered in a violent explosion. Her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, was suspected of arranging it. They married under a cloud of blood. Rebellion followed. She fled. In 1568, Mary crossed the border into England, seeking protection from her cousin. But what she found was a prison. Elizabeth never met her in person. She didn't need to. Mary was a threat, a figurehead for Catholic plots, a symbol of legitimacy to those who believed Elizabeth a usurper. And in the decades that followed, plot after plot emerged. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington plot. Each time Mary's name appeared. Whether or not she had planned them was irrelevant. Her very existence inspired rebellion. Elizabeth hesitated. She did not want blood on her hands. She had sent men to the block before, traitors, rebels, even friends. But a queen? A cousin? That was different. Still the pressure grew. Parliament demanded action. Her advisors, especially Sir Francis Walsingham, uncovered letters, ciphers, evidence. In 1586, the Babington plot broke open, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. And this time, Mary's own handwriting was found on the pages. She had replied. She had consented. There was no more room for doubt. And so Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Days passed. Then weeks. She wavered, delayed, changed her mind. But the council moved forward. The warrant was sent. The execution arranged. On February 8th, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was led to a scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore a black gown, a crucifix in her hand. Beneath her dress, she revealed a crimson petticoat, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. She forgave her executioner, prayed for her son, and then she knelt. It took more than one blow. The first stroke struck her neck, but did not sever it. A groan echoed through the chamber. The second finally separated head from shoulders. The executioner raised it high, only for the auburn wig to slip from his grasp, revealing thinning grey hair, cropped short beneath. Her body twitched. A small dog, hidden in her skirts, crawled out and lay beside her corpse. The room fell silent. Mary was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, but decades later, her son, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, would move her to Westminster Abbey. A monument was built for her there, larger than Elizabeth's, and Elizabeth? She never spoke of that day again. But those who knew her said something inside her dimmed. The Queen, who had once dazzled with her wit and sharp tongue, grew quieter in private. The weight of that decision to take the life of a fellow sovereign never quite lifted. She ruled for 16 more years, unmarried, unbending, immortal in myth, but mortal in body. And when death came to her in 1603, it came without spectacle. She lay upon cushions in Richmond Palace, surrounded by shadows, refusing food, refusing sleep, her mind drifting somewhere between memory and silence. She was 69, buried in Westminster Abbey above her sister Mary. But even she, Gloriana, could not stop the march of time, for the son of the cousin she executed would now wear her crown, a union of crowns, a new dynasty, and a new king. One raised in prophecy, shadowed by mothers and haunted by a fate that would lead one day to a blade. The torches that lined the nave of Westminster flickered in uncertain silence as the crown of England passed for the first time in history, not to a Tudor, but to a Stuart. James VI of Scotland, now James I of England. The son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-great-grandson of Henry VII, he ascended to the English throne peacefully, quietly, with the grace of lineage and the fortune of timing. Elizabeth had left no heirs, no rival strong enough to contest him. The wars of roses and Reformation were over, at least on parchment. A new age dawned, but the blood beneath the floorboards had not dried. James arrived in London in the summer of 1603. He crossed the border not as a conqueror, but as a king already made. In Scotland he had reigned since he was a year old, crowned while still in swaddling clothes after his mother Mary had been forced to abdicate. He had grown up in a court of wary nobles and long shadows, shaped by caution, schooled in compromise. In England he found wealth and splendour beyond anything he had known. But he also found something else. Whispers, plots, paranoia. The early years of his rule were marked not by upheaval but by tension. He was Protestant but leaned toward tolerance. He fancied himself a peacemaker between factions, a king who ruled by divine right but governed through consensus. And yet, within the quiet cathedrals and shadowed corners of English houses, a storm was building. For there were those who had long waited, through Elizabeth's long reign, through Mary's fall, through decades of persecution, for a Catholic king. And when they saw none, their hope turned to fire. In 1605, a group of conspirators gathered beneath the streets of Westminster. The Gunpowder Plot. Led by Robert Catesby, with Guy Fawkes as its most infamous instrument, they planned to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, with James inside. Their goal: decapitate the government, eliminate the king, and ignite a Catholic uprising. They stockpiled barrels of gunpowder beneath the floor, waited, prayed, and then, the night before, a warning letter. The authorities searched. They found Fawkes with the fuse. The explosion never came. Fawkes was tortured. The plot unravelled. Catesby was killed in a final, desperate standoff. The surviving conspirators were executed, hanged, drawn, quartered. England exhaled. And James, who had once spoken of tolerance, now tightened his grip. Anti-Catholic laws returned with new severity. Trust evaporated. The peace he had hoped to broker splintered like glass beneath his feet. Yet James remained firmly on the throne. He ruled for 2 decades, presiding over a court that glittered with poets and playwrights. Shakespeare thrived under his patronage. The King James Bible, a work of linguistic majesty, was commissioned and completed in 1611, echoing across the centuries in both prayer and poetry. But for all the gold and glory, James's court was riddled with tension. He lavished affection on his male favourites, George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, chief among them. His relationship with Parliament soured. He believed in kingship by divine right. Parliament believed in limits, and in the background always was his son, Charles, quiet, refined, cautious, a boy overshadowed by his bolder brother Henry, the Golden Prince. But in 1612, Henry fell ill with typhoid. Within days he was dead. Charles became heir. He was unready, some said unsteady. In 1625, James first died. He was 58. He had ruled Scotland for 57 years, England for 22. A man of words, not war, more scholar than sovereign. But the seeds he planted of royal absolutism, of courtly extravagance, of religious division would sprout bitter fruit. Charles first now wore the crown. He believed, as his father had, in divine right. But where James had balanced, Charles would assert. Where James had written, Charles would command. And where James had calmed rebellion, Charles would ignite it. For the next great death would not come quietly. It would come with the roar of a crowd, the silence of snow, and the fall of an axe onto a king's neck. The morning of January 30th, 1649, was cold and pale. A thick frost clung to the stone streets of London. The Thames moved slowly, its surface dusted with ice. Along the length of Whitehall Palace the crowd gathered, packed tightly in cloaks and hoods, their breath rising in mist. No festival brought them here, no parade, no coronation. They had come to watch a king die, Charles I. He stood within the banqueting house, clad in black. Beyond the windows, carpenters had worked through the night to construct a scaffold directly against the wall, a stage upon which monarchy would meet its reckoning. A passage had been cut through the wall so he might step directly from the hall to the platform, out of sight from the path below. It was quiet, but the silence throbbed with unease, for never before had England done such a thing. Kings had died, yes, in battle, by poison, by private murder, but never by trial, never by sentence, never by the will of the people. And yet the axe waited. To understand this moment, we must return to the reign of Charles himself, a reign that had begun with promise but unravelled into war. He was crowned in 1625, inheriting from James not just the crown, but the conviction that kings ruled by divine right, that their authority was God-given, unquestionable. Parliament, in Charles's view, was not a partner but an instrument, useful when convenient, dispensable when not. He married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess. The court, once moderately balanced, tilted toward ritual, ceremony and suspicion. Charles governed without Parliament for 11 years, raising funds through ancient taxes and forced loans. The people grumbled, the nobility grew restless. Religious reformers, especially the Puritans, feared a slide back toward Catholicism. Then in 1640, rebellion in Scotland forced Charles to summon Parliament again. And this time it did not yield. A storm of accusations, resistance and countermeasures followed. Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament, marching into the House of Commons himself, but they had already fled. The moment shattered trust forever. Civil war erupted. Royalists, Cavaliers, against parliamentarians, Roundheads. England split. The war dragged on for years, turning brother against brother, towns into garrisons. Charles, defeated, surrendered to the Scots. He believed he could manipulate divisions between his enemies, but they handed him over to Parliament. Even then, many still hoped for a negotiated peace. But Charles played both sides, encouraging rebellion from his captors' prisons, signing secret deals, breaking terms. It was the final betrayal. The army, now led by Oliver Cromwell, lost all faith in the king. Parliament, divided and weary, was purged of moderates in what became known as Pride's Purge. What remained was the Rump Parliament, and it resolved to do what had never been done. Put a king on trial. The charge: tyranny, treason and murder against the people of England. Charles refused to plead. He denied the court's authority. He stood in defiant silence, wearing a black cloak and a steady gaze. When sentence was passed, he did not beg. He did not weep. He simply asked for a moment to prepare. And now, here he stood. Outside, on the scaffold draped in black, the headsman waited, axe polished, masked, silent. Charles stepped through the low door into the cold morning. The crowd below, thousands deep, fell into stillness. He wore 2 shirts so he would not shiver. He feared the people might mistake it for fear. He turned to the assembled witnesses and said, "I am the King of England. I am the martyr of the people. I die a faithful man to my religion and to my God." He knelt, placed his neck on the block and whispered to the executioner, "I am the king, my good man. Do your duty." A moment passed. Then the axe fell. One clean stroke. The executioner lifted the severed head, blood dripping, and cried out, "Behold the head of a traitor!" A low moan rippled through the crowd. Some gasped, others turned away. A few in the front rows dipped cloths into the pooling blood, relics of a martyr. They buried Charles quietly in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. No grand funeral, no public mourning allowed. But the monarchy was gone. England became a republic, the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector. Churches were stripped of ornament, theatres closed, joy, laughter, colour, all dimmed under the weight of Puritan rule. And yet, no republic forged in blood lasts untouched. In time, the monarchy would return. Charles's son, Charles II, would be invited back. The axe would be hidden, the scaffold dismantled. But the ghost of that day in January would never quite leave the English soul, for they had killed a king, not in secrecy, not by poison, but beneath the sky, before the people and by their own hands. The years that followed the execution of Charles I were not filled with triumph. They were filled with quiet, with uncertainty, with the long shadow of absence. The king was dead, but the kingdom did not breathe easily. England, now a republic, floundered through its new identity. The monarchy had been abolished, the House of Lords dismantled, the crown, once a symbol of divine order, was reduced to memory, and in its place stood Oliver Cromwell. Not king, never king, but something very near it, Lord Protector. His court was austere, his rule absolute. There were no balls at Whitehall, no masks, no gilded entertainments. Music fell silent, paintings were taken down, fun was suspect, beauty a distraction. The theatre, once the pride of Elizabeth's age, was shuttered. Even Christmas was banned. But Cromwell was no ordinary despot. He was a soldier, a scripture reader, a man who had risen not by birth, but by blood and steel. He believed he was chosen, that God had placed him at the helm of England, not to enrich himself, but to reform the soul of a nation. He crushed rebellion in Ireland with terrible force. He dissolved Parliament when it disobeyed him. He ruled with a certainty that brooked, but certainty is not immortality. And in 1658, after years of failing health, Cromwell died. The sky that day was dark and wild. A storm blew across London, breaking windows, toppling chimneys. Some said it was an omen, others merely October. His body was buried with honour in Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens lay. But power is never so easily inherited. His son, Richard Cromwell, lacked his father's will. The Protectorate faltered, factions re-emerged, Parliament reassembled, the army grew restless, the Republic began to unravel, and as silence fell again over England's future, a name returned, spoken first in drawing rooms, then in the streets, then in Parliament itself. Charles, the boy who had fled across the sea, the son of the executed king, the one who had wandered the courts of Europe, bearded and charming, clever and cautious, waiting for the tide to turn. It did. In 1660, with Cromwell's system collapsing, Parliament sent for him. Charles II returned to England in May, riding through streets thick with flowers and cheers. The people, exhausted by years of grey, welcomed him like dawn. The monarchy was restored, but the past was not so easily buried. The men who had signed Charles I's death warrant were hunted. Some fled, others were arrested. 10 were executed, hanged, drawn and quartered, their bodies left to rot above city gates. Justice, they called it. Or vengeance. And Cromwell? His body was exhumed, dragged from Westminster, hung in chains at Tyburn, his head cut off and displayed on a spike above the roof of Westminster Hall, the very building from which his judges had once sentenced a king. It remained there for more than 20 years. Charles II ruled with laughter and lavishness. He reopened the theatres, restored the court, danced, drank, kept mistresses in gilded apartments. His reign became known as the Merry Monarch's time, but beneath the surface there were cracks. The plague returned in 1665, sweeping through the city, leaving thousands dead, corpses piled in carts. Families locked themselves away, fires burned in the streets to purify the air, and then the following year a greater fire still. The Great Fire of London. It began in a bakery, grew, leapt from building to building, consumed the medieval city in 4 days of roaring flame. St. Paul's Cathedral collapsed in ash, thousands were left homeless, the city became smoke. Still, Charles remained. He walked the fire lines, comforted the people. For a moment, the king was not merely figurehead but symbol. And yet, the spectre of succession returned. Charles had no legitimate children. He had dozens of illegitimate ones, lords, dukes, princes in all but name, but none born of a queen. His wife, Catherine of Braganza, bore him no heirs, and so the question of the crown turned once again toward his brother. James, a Catholic in a Protestant realm, and when Charles died in 1685, quietly of a stroke, after receiving last rites in the old faith, it was James who ascended the throne. a Stuart once more, but also a king whom many feared. For James II would reign not long, and his fall would be swift. But it would not be his death that shocked England. It would be the death of an idea, that kings could rule without question, that God chose and men obeyed. That too would burn. James II stood before the English court in 1685 with a crown upon his head and suspicion already in the air. He was not new to power. He had long been the Duke of York, brother to Charles II, Lord of the Navy, a veteran of battles and whispers both. But the moment he became king, the tone of the kingdom shifted. Unease curled through Parliament. Old fears stirred awake. He was Catholic. And England, though weary, though fractured, had drawn a line. It had allowed queens to die, boys to vanish, kings to fall, but this was different. James ruled with certainty. He believed in divine right, in absolute monarchy. He had watched his father executed by Parliament and now believed, with equal passion, that Parliament had no right to limit the crown. He began slowly. He filled posts with loyalists. He expanded the standing army. He repealed laws that discriminate against Catholics. On the surface, these were calls for tolerance. But beneath, many saw something darker, a reshaping of the realm's soul. And then in 1688, everything changed. His wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, a male heir. It seemed a blessing, but to many Protestants it was a nightmare. For now the succession was not just Catholic, it was secure. A new Stuart line stretching into the future, bound to Rome and absolutism. And some whispered the child was not real, that the Queen had faked the pregnancy, that a baby had been smuggled into the birthing room in a warming pan, that the rightful line had been manipulated by deceit. It was never proven. But belief, once ignited, spreads faster than fact. Across the sea, James's daughter, Mary, watched. She had been raised Protestant, married to William of Orange, ruler of the Dutch Republic, a powerful figure in his own right, and a man not prone to hesitation. Parliament turned to them both with a desperate invitation. In November of 1688, William landed in England with an army. No rebellion, no civil war, just swift, decisive movement. James's support collapsed, his army disbanded, his courtiers deserted. He fled, first captured, then released, then fled again, this time successfully, across the Channel to France. And with that, the English people declared something extraordinary. A king could be rejected. The event became known as the Glorious Revolution. In its aftermath, Parliament offered the crown not to the newborn son, nor to the king in exile, but to his daughter Mary and her husband William as joint sovereigns. But with it came a condition, the Bill of Rights. Passed in 1689, it laid the foundation for modern constitutional monarchy. No king could rule without Parliament. No standing army without consent. No arbitrary laws. No divine right unchallenged. And so the monarchy was remade, not abolished, not decapitated, but restrained. James II lived on in France at the court of Louis XIV, a sad, proud figure. He tried to reclaim the crown in Ireland, landing in 1689 with French troops at his side. But William met him at the River Boyne the next year. James lost. Again, he fled. He would never return to England. He died in 1701, in exile. Uncrowned, unwanted, a ghost of absolutism. His son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the so-called Old Pretender, would try to reclaim the throne, as would his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, in later years. But those attempts failed. Romantic, bloody, futile. And England moved on. Mary II died young. William ruled alone. Then came Anne, Mary's sister, the last of the Stuarts to sit upon the throne. Her reign brought union with Scotland, new wars abroad, and slow decay within. She died childless in 1714. 17 pregnancies. No surviving heir. And so the crown passed again, this time to a distant German cousin, George of Hanover, as dictated by the Act of Settlement which barred Catholics from the throne. The age of divine monarchy had ended. Kings and queens would still rule, but never again as they once had. The executions, the vanishings, the burnings, the forced abdications, all these had led to one quiet truth. Power must be questioned. And though the faces on the coins would change, though the palaces would rise and crumble and rise again, the blood that had soaked the soil of England through the medieval century would leave a stain the crown could never polish away. The crown remained, but now it trembled, not from enemies abroad, but from memory, from the long, slow toll of history's hand.